Good evening, and welcome to Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's installment provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep for once. So lie back, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath, and off we go. This evening we're reading a bit of history. The Brehon Laws, a Legal Handbook by Lawrence Ginnell, 1894. Let's begin. When it became known some time ago that I had undertaken to lecture on the Brehon Laws before the Irish Literary Society, London, one friend congratulated me on the fine subject I had taken in hand, and another on the same day asked me why in the world had I chosen such an uninteresting subject. To these two friends and the classes they typify, I respectfully dedicate this little volume. Lawrence Ginnell. Chapter 1. Ancient Law. As in law and all other branches of learning, some knowledge of one system is useful in the study of any other system. So also one cannot well appreciate the relative proportions and importance of what belongs to one nation without taking some account of the condition in the same respect at the same period of neighboring nations with which a comparison may be instituted. For this reason, I think our present subject should be introduced by a preliminary notice of the condition of law in early times in neighboring nations with which we are liable to be compared. We can, however, scarcely do more than glance at one such nation, and remembering where we are, and the circumstances of our country, the English nation seems the most appropriate for our purpose. The first collection of Saxon laws into writing was made under Ethelbert, King of Kent, after St. Augustine had converted him to Christianity and baptized him, St. Augustine having arrived in Kent in AD 597. Ethelbert's was a collection of the most meager scraps, such as only extreme poverty in this respect could make any people consider worth collecting or preserving. After that time, collections of laws continued to be made occasionally in Kent and the various little kingdoms into which England was then divided, but none of them reached respectable dimensions until that of Alfred the Great, towards the end of the 9th century. Alfred is said to have been educated in Ireland. His is the earliest collection the English nation can show of any real value. Besides those given under Alfred's own name, it is probable that he may also be credited with the so-called Dooms of Ine. It is believed that none of the originals of the early English laws, or works relating to law, were written in the language of the English people, that the originals in Saxon times were always in Latin, and those of Norman times in Latin or Norman French, and that the copies of the Saxon Dooms now extant are transcripts from the translations made for vulgar use. The originals of Acts of Parliament continued to be written in Norman French down to the beginning of the 16th century, and the records in legal proceedings down to the middle of the 18th century. The brand of native inferiority, first impressed upon the people, continued thus long impressed upon the laws the people were bound to obey. Even in this year of grace, 1894, the royal assent is given to Acts of Parliament in words which neither the Queen nor her subjects understand, and which never were used by any generation of Englishmen. Bearing in mind these few facts regarding the early condition and historical development of English law, we come in a proper mood to consider the most archaic system of law and jurisprudence of Western Europe, of which many records now exist, namely, what are now generally known as the Brehon Laws. This is not their real name. Irish laws, or Gaelic laws, would be a better name for English speakers to use, but the thing meant has always been known to Gaelic speakers as finachas, a general term for all law without special reference to that of Ireland was recht, but the law of the Gaels was finachas. It included Cain law, being that which was enacted or solemnly sanctioned by national assemblies, was of universal obligation, and could be administered only by professional judges. And it also included Uravis law, which was law relating to local matters, modified by local assemblies and by local customs, and which might be administered by the fleis, who were not professional lawyers. Inquirers into the native antiquities of Western Europe naturally turned to Caesar to learn what was the state of things he found existing in Gaul, and if that could be ascertained with certainty, we might reasonably assume that the state of things in Ireland at that and at a later period was not very different. But although it was very good of Caesar to write so much as he did, his mind was far too much occupied with Caesar to be troubled recording many facts relating to mere barbarous life, or with adequately checking those recorded. Caesar and other Roman writers give it to be understood that the Gauls on some occasions sacrificed human beings to their gods, and some modern writers calmly assume as a matter beyond question that the Gauls sacrificed human beings in hecatombs, and that the Druids presided over these horrible butcheries. The innate absurdity of such assumptions might have prevented their expression, were it not that the ghastly and sensational grows upon and takes possession of the mind that conceives it, until from excessive fullness the temptation to communicate it becomes irresistible. When communicated, it strikes the hearer or reader more forcibly and effectually than truth, modest and sober, can ever hope to do. Remembering what gross and scandalous falsehoods are sometimes deliberately told of our own contemporaries, even by people of respectable and sanctimonious exterior, I cannot admit that there is any truth in these stories of the Gauls and their Druids, who are unable to return with their explanation. It is probable that either Caesar was misinformed, or some ceremony observed by the Gauls in putting criminals to death was misinterpreted to him or by him. At all events, there is no reason at all to think that human sacrifice ever was practiced in Ireland. Owing to the isolated geographical position of Ireland, references to it by Roman and other ancient writers are comparatively few and of a vague and general character. But fortunately, a full study of Gaelic Ireland can be made from native sources without consulting other authorities except for corroboration. Many leading facts of Irish history have been quite satisfactorily ascertained to the extent of 300 years before Caesar's time. It would, however, be difficult to lay down a connected and consequential narrative until about AD 250, in the reign of King Cormac. This was the time at which some of the laws we are about to consider were reduced to their present form, though they had existed in some other form long before. Those laws, as well as the laws comprised in the greater collection made 2 centuries later, had probably existed as laws 1,000 years before Cormac's time. Almost all the Brehon laws had actually reached their full proportions and maturity about the time that Alfred was reducing to order the scraps of elementary law he found existing among his own people. It is with the remains of the laws that then existed in Ireland, boulders from the Dun, that we are mainly concerned. Needless to say, they were not written in a foreign tongue. No foreign mind conceived them, no foreign hand enforced them. They were made by those who, one would think, ought to make them, the Irish. They were made for the benefit of those for whose benefit they ought to have been made, the Irish. Hence they were good, if not perfect in the abstract, yet good in the sense that they were obeyed and regarded as priceless treasures, not submitted to as an irksome yoke. And the presence or absence of popular sympathy with law I take to be a true test of the quality of that law and the very touchstone of good government. Originating in the customs of early settlers in times beyond the reach of history, these laws grew in volume and in perfection down to the time mentioned, after which, though continually applied, though copied, recopied, and commented upon, little of substantial value was added to them. They prevailed over the whole country until the arrival of the Anglo-Normans, and they prevailed over the whole country except the Pale until the beginning of the 17th century. In such a great length of time, they must have undergone more or less change, but the political condition of the country during all that time being wholly adverse to true development, the actual changes may be taken to have been the very least possible, in proportion as they are lost in utility owing to this cause. They now gain in value to us as archaic relics, and not to us alone, but to continental peoples, to some especially because they claim a common origin with us, and have little or no native records reaching so far back as ours. To all for their philological and general antiquarian interest, and because in these laws can be studied nearer to their source than anywhere else, the ancient legal ideas of a Celtic people expanding free from external control. Other Celtic nations were subjected to Roman sway and modified by Roman influences, and now little can be ascertained regarding their pre-Roman state except through Roman sources. The isolated position of our country, perhaps a disadvantage on the whole, had at all events the effect of leaving one nation truly Celtic, while its kindred on the continent were being transmuted. The incursions of the Danes produced the first external effect on our laws, but only to the extent of stopping their growth and development and throwing what may be called the organs of development into disorder, from which, owing to historical causes, they never recovered. The Danes never obtained supreme control over Ireland as they did over England and the north of Gaul, but they harassed and plundered the people, lowered the standard of religion, morality, and patriotism, and fatally smote the institutions of the country, so that from the first arrival of the Danes in AD 795, the nation and its laws ceased to progress. The laws were petrified and fossilized, and remained at the expulsion of the Danes what they had been at their arrival, and they remain practically the same still, for to conquer the Danes at Clontarf, though hard the task, was easier than to restore efficiency and fresh growth to institutions once paralyzed, or to revive national patriotism, the stagnation of which had become normal. Those institutions had not recovered their former vigor when the Anglo-Normans came, threw the country once more into turmoil, and kept it so. The Normans, like the Danes, had conquered England and established their own institutions there. But even they never conquered the whole of Ireland, and institutions of their introduction flourished only in the Pale, a small district whose extent varied with the fortunes of war, rarely exceeding 4 of the present Leinster counties. The Anglo-Norman settlers in other parts of Ireland conformed in the main to the Irish laws, with here and there some slight modifications which were strictly transgressions. Successive English governments sent over deputies and governors, nominally to rule Ireland, but really to rule the Pale, to create as much dissension as possible beyond that limit, and at any rate to maintain a foothold. A country so circumstanced, partially conquered, the mutilated prey for which two nations hungered and tore and thwarted each other, was one in which the rational development of law, or of anything else, was scarcely possible. And thus it comes to pass that the laws may be said to remain today substantially what they were before the arrival of the Danes more than 1,000 years ago. Chapter 2. The existing remains of Irish law. Most of the literary remains of ancient Ireland that are really valuable and characteristically beautiful appear to belong to the same distant period, and therefore they are highly interesting philologically, quite apart from the intrinsic beauty of some, which is very great. Of all those remains, those dealing with law are, considered as literature, the least attractive. But their value to the earnest student of antiquity is inferior to none, but is perhaps superior to all the rest, owing to their rigorously authentic character. The charge of having been produced or tinged by imagination cannot be made against the laws, rules, and customs which actually controlled the daily lives, conduct, and destinies of our ancestors, and under which they labored, fought, played, and prayed as occasion demanded. These remains at least represent what were once the realities of life, and the knowledge and the study of them must, with absolute certainty, help so far as they go to dispel the mist of years. We are brought, if possible, still closer to the actuality of individual life by the suits and judgments which are scattered through these laws for the purpose of illustrating their principles and their application. And while one reads, if perchance his taste should be of wider scope, he is enabled to gather incidentally much archaeological information, not strictly legal, but of a kind difficult, if at all possible, to glean from other sources, all stamped here with the authenticity of the law, and not less valuable for being thus given without design. The fact is as expressive as it is painful, that beyond the limited operations of one or two stunted societies, almost the whole of our Gaelic records, laws, and literature remained in manuscript, and practically inaccessible until the middle of the 19th century, and that much of those materials remain so even now at the close of the century. Most of those manuscript books, and some of the longer tracts, the legal as well as the others, refer to and quote from other and older books, sometimes by name, sometimes by a description which had become recognized as a name, as the white book of such a person, the black book of such a place, the yellow book or the speckled book of so-and-so, and sometimes the reference is general as to other versions or other books. From these references, it is evident that, although we still possess a great deal of written matter as compared with other countries, far more than we possess has been lost. This is not wonderful in the circumstances of Ireland, but it is none the less matter for regret. Still, competent judges say that our extant manuscript materials are, both for antiquity and intrinsic worth, treasures such as no nation north of the Alps can boast of. Anyone who suspects this for a Gaelic exaggeration had better visit the Royal Irish Academy and have his incredulity speedily and agreeably cured by the evidence of his own eyes. Whatever else may be said of those remote ancestors of ours, it must be admitted that they were singularly devoted to literature, and if the remains of their work have a high value and interest for strangers in Teutons, to us whose heritage they are, and whose privilege and pride it is to call Ireland our native land, they should not be alone valuable and interesting, but sacred. A people possessing such precious monuments and indifferent to them would certainly be unworthy of the race and country that produced them, and would merit the censure of civilized mankind. Do we value these treasures as we ought? Do we escape the censure or fall under it? Apparently, we fall under it, and this while we possess the power and at heart the desire to escape it. In practice, we neglect what in theory we venerate, and thus, as in other respects, we perpetuate against ourselves as a nation a wrong begun by others. But this extraordinary condition of things has not come about spontaneously, as a reader of Mr. Standish O'Grady's heroic period might infer. Mr. O'Grady, in common with all who study the subject, laments the fact that Irishmen of the present day devote so little attention to the extraordinary wealth of historic treasures they possess. But the implied assertion is only half a truth, and the candor that prompts telling half a truth when bitter to Irishmen will justify telling the remaining half, though it should be bitter to Englishmen. In addition to which, we, as real inquirers, are entitled to the whole truth. Ours is the bitterness of loss, theirs the bitterness of guilt. If to be made wince be a wholesome discipline for us, it cannot be unwholesome for our neighbors. Our alleged indifference, then, so far as it exists, is neither native nor natural to us, but is a plant of English culture, and a necessary result of the species of English rule that Ireland has experienced. Both Danes and Normans, the former especially, destroyed our manuscripts in the course of warlike operations, but to modern Englishmen from Elizabeth's time downwards, Ireland's darkest age, to men who came not frankly to plunder as the Danes did, but to govern us and set us a bright example, some of them with Bibles in their hands and scripture on their lips. To these men the distinction is due of having, in times of so-called peace and in cold blood, burned and destroyed our books, hanged or hunted their owners as vermin, made it criminal to teach or learn the language in which they were written, or indeed to teach or learn at all. The alternative, or rather twofold object of this enlightened statesmanship, being to drive the Celts out of their native land, or reduce them to savagery in it. Both policies have had a large measure of success. Neither has completely succeeded. The Irishmen who, when their own fortunes and hopes, like those of their country, were utterly ruined, risked liberty and life itself during that perilous age for the preservation of those precious monuments of the past, must not be charged with indifference, but credited with devotedness almost equaling that of the original writers. As few ancient nations have been more fruitful in original literary effort, so few modern nations have shown more attachment to literary treasures than the Irish, and in no other case that I am aware of has that natural and creditable attachment been subjected to such a terrible strain. On this very subject, let me quote from Dr. Sullivan, the learned editor of O'Curry's Lectures on the Manners and Customs of the Ancient Irish. Dr. Sullivan says, quote, "During the first part of the 18th century, the possession of an Irish book made the owner a suspected person, and was often the cause of his ruin. In some parts of the country, the tradition of the danger incurred by having Irish manuscripts lived down to within my own memory, and I have seen Irish manuscripts which had been buried until the writing had almost faded and the margins rotted away, to avoid the danger their discovery would entail at the visit of the local yeomanry. End quote. Was not that a pretty state of things? What Dr. Sullivan saw was, of course, but a single isolated instance after the real danger had passed away. But from it we may judge how much was destroyed under Elizabeth, under Cromwell, under William III, and throughout the whole of that dark age. And the calculation is materially assisted by the lurid stories heard by some of us at our fathers' firesides. It is morally certain that at the present moment some priceless Irish manuscripts are mouldering away in old walls, caves, graves, and other places under the earth. The causes of our apparent indifference to historical treasures are so obvious that they cannot possibly have escaped even the most casual and careless reader of our modern history. Into the soul of every Irishman worthy of the name they must be indelibly burnt. Everyone who cares at all about Ireland knows them, and knows that the real wonder is that we have any such treasures, and that anyone cares for them. Mr. O'Grady has an intimate knowledge of all this, yet he seizes an occasion to censure neither Elizabeth nor Cromwell, neither the imported yeomanry who were planted on the fat lands of our people, nor the governors who planted them there, but Irishmen. Here surely is perceptible the taint of that bitterly anti-Irish institution, Trinity College, Dublin. A man educated anywhere else in the world would, in the premises, place the blame on other shoulders, and if he blamed Irishmen at all in this connection, it would be very different grounds. It does not afford much matter for pride on that side, or for shame on this, that the Irish people could be and were by brute force robbed of their learning for the purpose of civilizing them. But brute force has not yet robbed them of their intelligence or of their love of learning. These, though in a measure rendered latent, still exist and will yet respond to more rational treatment. The number of persons who can read the manuscripts has indeed been reduced, but the number who would risk much in their preservation is as large as ever, and certainly their veneration would not be less if the vellum were found to smell of turf smoke contracted in the course of such a history. However this may be, and whatever may be thought of ourselves, we have at least this much matter for legitimate satisfaction, that the existence of these manuscripts renders it impossible for anyone with a decent regard for truth to charge our ancestors with ignorance. Commercially, it were better for us if the order of merit were reversed. But however low we may have fallen, we have not reached the depth at which the commercial view alone is adopted. Neither man nor nation lives by bread alone, and if we are satisfied that merit rests where it does, no one else has a right to complain. In spite of the burning and drowning of manuscripts, a vast number still exist in public libraries and in private collections, in Ireland, in England, and on the continent. Some of those relating to law are separate works, while others are written on the same vellum or otherwise bound up together with histories, genealogies, poems, religious works, and the like. All have come down by successive transcription. Of the most important works there are duplicate copies, hardly any of them being quite complete, and most of them differing slightly in text owing to the causes which similarly affect all ancient manuscripts, as want of time or want of diligence on the part of transcribers. Most of the existing legal manuscripts are believed to have been written, that is, copied from older ones, between the beginning of the 12th and the end of the 14th century. None of the originals, which were written in the 5th century, now exist, nor are the existing manuscripts thought to have been copied directly from those originals. They are considered to be copies of copies. Repeated transcripts had already been made with, on each occasion, some modernization here and there of the antiquated phraseology, or with the introduction of a gloss or a commentary to render the matter intelligible. The laws were originally written in the Birla Féini, the Fenian dialect of Gaelic. As this language in course of time tended to become obsolete, the laws tended to become unintelligible, and the tenacious adherence to old forms of expression common to all laws had to be severed or counteracted in some way. The transcribers did not act according to any uniform plan, nor did any transcriber continue throughout the work the mode of treatment with which it began, but each from time to time translated early into late Gaelic to the extent of some words that were in his time difficult, or left the original phrase standing and supplied a gloss or a commentary. Each may be considered to have done the best that his circumstances permitted, for writing was not 1,000 years ago the simple thing it now is. The great antiquity, both of the original text and of the commentaries, is shown in several ways. Quotations from both are found in works admittedly written not later than the 10th century. Some parts of these older commentaries, although written later than the text, are still very ancient, and besides, they contain, as quotations or otherwise, some fragments of traditional law fully as archaic as any in the text. The language being of a highly technical, elliptical, and abbreviated character too, and devoid of all proper definitions, is now scarcely intelligible to speakers of what is nominally the same language, and of the few who can read, still fewer can confidently construe. Even some of the Gaelic transcribers of the Middle Ages may possibly have erred in its construction. Imagine a work treated at one time in the manner described, and then, after another century or two had elapsed, treated again in a similarly irregular fashion by another transcriber. Here a literal copy, there a translation, in another place a gloss or a commentary, to keep pace with the further changes in the spoken language, and you will have a fair idea of the present condition of the Brehon laws. What are thus spoken of under the general name of commentaries contain much matter not suggested by that title. Many independent decisions and dicta, old and current, are inserted under particular texts with which some of them have little or no connection, but as the most suitable or most convenient place the writer could find for them. The most valuable of the commentaries were written before the existing manuscripts were transcribed, and they interpret not alone obscure passages in the text, but the substantive law itself. Later commentaries were written by various hands on the present manuscripts, and even these may not be all original. They were written between the original lines, on the margin, at the foot, wherever room could be found. For the most part, a text is given, but in some instances the whole of the original text does not now exist, only the opening words of passages being retained in the existing transcripts. These opening words, used as headings or catchwords, are quite meaningless in themselves as they now stand. But of course they were full of meaning for those whose business it was to know what followed. They are now followed by commentaries, from which may be gathered the substance of the original, as a commentary on the Lord's Prayer might be headed with the words, Our Father. Comments upon law and glosses upon words are inserted without any apparent attempt to keep them separate, and with the latter are frequently given an assortment of etymological speculations in which the writers display some knowledge of what they call the four principal languages of the world: Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and Gaelic. Derivations of words, of rules, and of customs are suggested almost at random, and are no more reliable than similar attempts of ancient Roman writers, some of them being clearly fabulous and not seriously meant. When the commentary is mainly etymological and in the nature of a translation of the text, and both are translated into English side by side, the result in the English is an unpleasant tautological repetition of the same thing. Sometimes the commentators purport to explain the text, start with the apparent object, but with a relative pronoun for which it is now difficult to find an antecedent, plunge in media res, and end by leaving the whole matter quite as obscure as the text had left it. Accounts of the effects of particular judgments are also met with, some of them legendary, others of real value. According to one commentator, quote, Shunkamacal Cluin was not wont to pass judgment until he had pondered upon it in his breast the night before. End quote. This probably refers to a judgment in a grave case involving human life. Judges of the Hebrew nation in early times were accustomed to fast the night and morning before passing a death sentence. The text of the old laws is fairly self-consistent throughout. The commentaries, as might be expected from the manner in which they were written by different hands at different times, are not always reconcilable, and there is a good deal of tiresome repetition in them. The translators have found them useful in many cases, misleading in some. They are interesting throughout. The condition just described involves so many difficulties in dealing with these laws that Gaelic scholars generally in the last century believe the translation of them to have become impossible, the key having been lost. If occasionally an educated Englishman of the present day finds the legal documents in which he is personally concerned hard to understand, though assisted by his knowledge of the actual facts to which they relate, his knowledge of the language and of contemporary life in all its phases, how much more difficult must it not be to draw legal writings of a distant past from their dust and cobwebs and the greater load of impedimenta just mentioned, to understand them fully and to render them correctly, when the system of life which those laws contemplated and provided for has vanished from the earth, leaving no derivative institutions in existence. In 1852, a royal commission was appointed to translate and publish the ancient laws and institutes of Ireland, and thus bring them within the reach of English readers. The nature of the undertaking may be judged from the difficulties enumerated, and many others must have been encountered in the actual performance of the work. It is only just that we who can now read those laws at our ease should remember those difficulties and be grateful to the learned men who have surmounted them. And we cannot be surprised to find that, distinguished scholars though they were and are, they have actually failed to understand some passages which they have translated, and they repeatedly emphasize the fact that their translation is in certain parts conjectural only and must not be taken as final or satisfactory. Many technical terms relating to status, ranks, and degrees, as well as names of fines, diseases of horses, etc., are retained in the English untranslated, some because the translators were unable to satisfy themselves as to the true meaning, others because the words have no direct or adequate equivalents in English, and would demand a tedious circumlocution each time they had to be used. Others because, although the translators understood them and could find suitable equivalents in English, Yet remembering that the ancient Irish manuscript materials have never in modern times been fully investigated, the translators have, with commendable modesty and patriotism, retained the original words, appending to them temporary explanations to serve until that better time comes for which, without being politicians, we are all permitted to hope when those laws can be thoroughly analyzed and explained. This latter work is one of greater difficulty still, and should be undertaken only by men free from the preliminary work of translating, free from the necessity of making a living, endowed with a keen and unconquerable genius for minute research. This was not the work undertaken by the commissioners. It still awaits the enthusiast. That these laws should be found difficult is not wonderful, seeing that the English are now unable to translate some technical terms in the Saxon laws so late as those of the reign of Canute. The Brehon law commissioners have already published, at different dates as the work proceeded, 4 volumes of the ancient laws of Ireland, and a 5th is now in the press, 1894. The ancient law book, called the Shancas Mór, or rather all that remains of it, was the first selected for publication, and being one of the oldest and most important portions of the Brehon laws which have escaped destruction, this ancient work occupies the whole of the first volume of the translations, the whole of the second volume, except an appendix of scraps, and a portion of the third volume. The part of the Shancas Mór given in the first volume deals directly with the law of distress, that is, the seizure by distraint of property for the satisfaction of debt, and only incidentally with other subjects. It will be seen in the chapter on distress why this branch of law required so much space and was given this extraordinary prominence. This first volume of the translations was published in 1865. The second volume, which was published in 1869, contains very interesting facsimiles of ancient writing, and more than 400 pages of text of the Shancas Mór, consisting of the completion of the law of distress, the law of services of hostage sureties, from which I have not drawn for the present occasion, the law of fosterage, the law of tenure, and the law of social connections, all of which are of the highest interest. The text of this volume is preceded by a long dissertation, the object of which is to prove that St. Patrick was a Briton. Interesting though this might be as a separate publication, dependent for its worth solely on its author's name, I cannot but think it out of place here, where the question cannot be discussed on equal terms. In the third volume of the translations, published in 1873, further specimens of ancient writing are given. The volume contains a long general preface, followed by a special introduction to the remaining portion of the Shancas Mór, the Chorus Beckna, which itself occupies 79 pages. This is the conclusion of the Shancas Mór, so far as it is now known to exist. The Chorus Beckna, or customary law, is said to have been the 5th book of the original work, there being then more than 5 books. Possibly the remaining portions exist somewhere, but they have not yet been discovered. The Shancas Mór, as now given to us, is not clearly divided into books. Portions of the original work having been lost, we may be thankful to get the remainder kept together in any way. After the conclusion of the Shancas Mór in the 3rd volume, we are given nearly 100 pages of preface to the Book of Achill, followed by the Book of Achill itself, which, with an appendix, occupies over 500 pages. The 4th volume opens with a long and elaborate introduction containing a discussion of the different subjects treated in the volume, but dealing especially with the Irish family and clan system. The text of this volume consists of a number of tracts selected as especially illustrating the land laws of the ancient Irish, the law of taking possession, and the laws affecting the constitution of clan and fine and the rights and obligations of members of those two organizations. I have no knowledge of the contents of the 5th volume, now in type. Well, I think we'll stop there with that introduction to the Brehon Laws, a legal handbook by Lawrence Ginnell. Hopefully, you're no longer awake to hear this, but if you are, and you'd like something else to do besides think about law, won't you consider leaving us a positive review on iTunes? It's very helpful. If you'd like to connect, or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, catch us on Twitter at BoringBooksPod. If you'd like to support this podcast, or leave a comment, you can also catch us on patreon.com. Just search for Boring Books for Bedtime. Thank you so much for joining me. Until our next boring book, good night.